We are all here because we are explorers of consciousness, not satisfied with the level of consciousness that had so far been achieved, requiring greater context, greater understanding, greater depth, greater freedom, greater capacity to love, to understand the other, to relate without projection, to purify our own minds of those autonomic processes that no longer serve us. We're living in a society that is probably the first one in history not to have specific rites of passage from childhood to adulthood. In the so-called primitive tribal societies, there were ordeals and vision quests and shamanic processes of reaching altered states and of entering into the extreme levels of possibility for existence of the body, whether through fasting and through other kinds of physical and psychological self-torments that would stretch our capacities to discover what are the limits of the body, what are the limits of the mind. But today we don't go through such passages, or if we do go through them, they no longer work because they are processes that were adapted to different kinds of societies. But the kinds of rites of passage that we need, we have to build, we have to construct, we have to create. And the catch-22 difficulty is that once you have assumed you know what are the rules of the game, and you choose to adapt to the game of the social system, and you congeal a kind of identity that enables you to find a comfortable niche within the capitalist system and have a career and children and a life with an ordinary sort of relationality that accepts a certain level of consciousness and no longer aspires to change or to grow or to become different from what you are, because then that would disrupt everything you have established. And so one then tends toward a kind of psychological conservatism. And this, of course, leads to a stagnation of growth. But when you reach a situation in a historical context in which the rules of the game change on you midstream, or the game itself stops working and brings you diminishing returns, or no dividends at all for all the effort that you put out, and you end up devastated with divorce and bankruptcy and all of the other plagues that the system often forces on people, regardless of how loyal they have been to the ethics of the system and the aesthetics and the belief system in all of its modalities, including loyalty to a family system that in itself no longer makes sense because the people in the family have less in common than you have with your friends or with people you've never met on the internet. And there is no way to have conversations or communication with those people that you thought you should be most close to. And the alienation and separation, the gaps get wider and wider until one feels a very weird sense of isolation, no matter how close you seem to appear to be with other people. but there's a misunderstanding that remains constant and that grows in its inability to bridge the gap with others who you discover are not who you thought they were, and all of your idealizations of parents and family and friends also collapse, including your idealization of yourself. And this leads to a different level of exploration in a search for authenticity and for discovering what you might be underneath what you thought you were that is now crumbling before your eyes. And all the meaning that you thought that you had discovered also collapses in a realization that it was simply an artificial fabrication, a construct that was fictional all along and simply meant to indoctrinate you into an enslavement to a system that doesn't really care about you. So the more one matures into recognizing the true nature of the situation that one is in, one realizes one has to find one's strength within. And one loses one's appetite for dependency. But one also discovers that this process that seemed to be about differentiation from other members of the family system and individuation to discover your specialness, your uniqueness as a person, also begins to morph into a letting go of that illusory individual and a realization that you are actually universal. And so the process beyond a certain point becomes the fading away of everything that you had attained and gained and thought you had become, and all of the diplomas that prove you earned it, and all of the other signs of credibility. And eventually all of the signifiers of an ego identity you find to be completely unable to relate to. And you end up in a complete state of not knowing anything or who you are or what anything is. I hope everyone has at least reached that place within the journey. But then there's a beyond to that, which is the realization that this emptiness and not knowing is the portal into a different kind of knowledge, of consciousness in itself, that no longer strives to know or to gain or to possess or to control, but begins to function in a mode of surrender, to discovery, to a new level of innocence, and of freeing oneself from the last enchainment to belief in one's lack, one's inadequacy, one's sinfulness, however one had been limited and hobbled by the belief systems, whether of the religion or the society or the particular traumas, the bullying or whatever other means that the hierarchy created a sense of inadequacy. All of this too gets left behind, and the consciousness enters into a level of its being that can make use of the not knowing to recognize the infinity of potential meanings that is always relevant to any situation, and not try to force feed one into some definite state of being. And one gives up the effort to disambiguate oneself and one's concepts from all that is. And this willingness to enter into something, not just a vagueness, but a recognition that any use of language is going to have an inherent incoherence in it, since language doesn't correspond to the real. And when one looks at any of the institutions of society, take religion, take Christianity as one exemplar of that, you find very conservative forms of Christianity that support the system and encourage you to accept your enslavement in the working class or whatever it is that you are being told to accept and to knuckle under. And then you have the liberation theologians that say, no, Christ was the ultimate revolutionary, don't give in, and strive to disrupt the establishment and bring more truth and more light and speak truth to power and all of that form of Christianity. But when you read the Gospels or the Acts of the Apostles or any of that, it's clearly an ambiguity of text itself that cannot tell you what was originally meant, or even if there was an original meaning, because the context has so changed and the language in which you read these texts is translated again and again from an original that you cannot know. Even if you were to learn Aramaic or ancient Greek, you would no longer be able to have the context to recognize the signifiers of the particular meanings of the slang that was used in the particular orations that were written down, usually much later. And so these kinds of undecidabilities then force one to discover authority within oneself and not to project it outside. But one cannot claim an authority prematurely. And so there's a very interesting historical evolution that religions go through. And I think the most interesting is that of Buddhism, that we can learn a lot from, particularly from the discoveries of the Dunhuang caves that I've mentioned before, earlier in the 20th century. Much more important than the discoveries of the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi Gospels, because they discovered schools of Buddhism that were oppressed and not only persecuted, but completely eliminated from memory, literally obliterated. And those include the original Tibetan form of Zen. But even more important than that, I've discovered, is a school of Buddhism, which I'm probably not pronouncing correctly, but Sanjie, which is often now translated since the discovery of these banished and banned sutras, the three levels school, or the three stages. And it begins with the understanding that the human nature is in decline. We're not progressing upward. We're losing the capacities we used to have and entering into a very narrow egoic mode of consciousness that has tunnel vision and cannot recognize or import into itself the higher dimensions of its own reality. It has cut itself off from its roots and from its higher potentials. And that decline is going to exponentially increase, so that the original teachings of the Buddha will not be able to be understood. Even 500 years after the Buddhist teaching, there will be a whole new teaching. And in fact, there was. The Mahayana replaced the Hinayana. They say even the Hinayana was a complete misunderstanding of the original teachings of Buddha. But then there would be a further phase in which this middle kind of Dharma that was still able to make use of the resources of consciousness to explode the ego construct and open to the infinite, even that would be lost. And there would be a period where the ego would be so densely defended and completely in a shell of narcissism and paranoia and delusion, that it would be absolutely impossible even to give any teachings that could be understood in that final phase. That the state of delusion would be total for nearly everyone. So this school said, how can we, before we get to that last phase, come up with some methods that we will be able to give to people in that condition to help them at least know they're in that condition and to help them break through it. And so these texts were written specifically as time capsules to be given to people at the end of the age when they would no longer be able to understand the original teachings. So naturally, they completely banned these and eliminated them from ever being discovered. But of course, as the drama of the intention of God can't be overcome, they were discovered and recently translated. And they're very useful. At least I found them to be. And what they say is, in a nutshell, that yes, it's true. You are in a state of perfect and absolute delusion. Okay? If you can recognize that and accept it and not believe in your delusion, you're already halfway out of it. Okay? But the other thing to realize is the part of your consciousness that has been encapsulated in that delusion is not all of your being. You can't capture an infinite consciousness into a finite delusion. So all that has been captured is the part of your consciousness that is identified with that delusion, which we can call the ego. But that in fact, because you are infinite and universal consciousness, you are the Buddha nature. So even at the very moment that you are in your darkest despair and anxiety and paranoia, you are simultaneously already liberated into the bliss of true Buddhahood. It's not that you have to get from the delusion to Buddhahood and you can't do it. That's the delusion. The reality is that you can't ever be anything but the Buddha nature, because that's all that is. And so even if there are arisings of delusional modes of consciousness within that infinite field of absolute consciousness that is itself truth, and is itself love, and is itself light, even though there may be an apparent fall into such a delusional state, the fact is that you didn't fall. That state simply arose within you. And if you can contain the delusion without struggling by believing when the delusional thoughts come, I can't do it, I can't stop my mind, I can't find peace, I can't find silence, all of that delusional struggle, instead of identifying with it, looking at it and saying, poor thing, let's give some peace to that deluded node. Don't identify with it, but realize that you contain it and you pervade it. And from that space that's beyond and cannot be captured by any delusion or any identity, you can realize that you are in both levels of consciousness simultaneously, and not favor the speaking, linguistic element of consciousness that is the deluded element, but the silent witness that is able to free it from its identification simply by disinvesting in that particular use of language. Now, during the middle period that was predicted by these Chinese Buddhists of the Sanjia school, what they predicted happened, which was that within Zen Buddhism, or Chan in the Chinese version, there was a split into two schools. One was the Lin Chi, or the Rinzai sect, that in the Japanese version, and the Soto sect, or school. And the Soto Zen Buddhists, among whom is Hongji, who I've been reading lately, were, you could say, quietists. And they say what Zen is about is simply emptying out and being the silent field of presence and then merging into it. The Rinzai school, which is simply a Japanese pronunciation of Lin Chi, the man who founded it, is based on the wild use of language in order to disrupt the logic of the ego. And that's where you get all the Zen koans and those very strange conversations that don't make sense, and the shouting and the hitting each other with sticks and all of these kinds of relationalities that seem to be quite mad and yet can produce moments of kensho or enlightenment. And they are actually poetic warpings of language in order to bring out latent possibilities of meaning moreness that enable one to reach that infinite consciousness in which language itself opens out into all of the poetic potentialities of infinite meaningfulness. And so when, for example, in a famous koan, the monk asks the Roshi, why did Bodhidharma come to China? And the answer is the flowers that surround the outhouse. Is that a metaphor? Is that an evasion? Is that simply to show the absurdity of the question? You know, what is that? And yet the monks who would hear that originally became enlightened by hearing it, okay? And maybe had a more pleasant trip to the outhouse as a result. But at any rate, their ability to communicate something in a phrase like that we might have to write a whole book, and books have been written about what is the meaning of that, were such that they could enable an enrichment of consciousness that could use a very tiny bit of linguistic information and turn that into a recognition of the infinite consciousness that produced it. So it is the need to get out of the limitation of the signifiers that have produced a false sense of definiteness that whenever we explore it, we realize is incoherent and inconsistent and reaches a point of failure in which that identity that you have chosen to believe you are will not be able to handle a certain situation that goes beyond the particularity of the system in which it defines itself. And so if one is going to be able to live in a reality that is not limited by the systems of thought that we try to impose on it, we have to be free to explore a continual reformatting and reparadigmization of our reality, and an ability to live beyond the limitations of meaning. So the capacity then to meditate brings you to a soundless understanding of the real that enables the recognition that the world that you find yourself in, you are only in because you believe you are in it. And you will only see what you believe as a preconception. When you let go of all the preconceptions that you have about yourself and your world and all that is entailed that you have thought you learned about both, then all of what you perceive shifts, changes, falls away. and the true nature of the real, of this holographic field. And in a hologram, every point contains the whole. The microcosm contains the macrocosm. But here we have a situation where even the macrocosm is a delusional representation of that real that's indescribable and not perceivable by the senses or knowable by rationality. And it's that level that we want to get to in order to be able to redream that holographic environment in which we inhabit and can influence, because whatever shift happens within the point of consciousness that we are affects the whole and recontextualizes it for everyone, not just for oneself. And so it's that level of empowerment that cannot come from an ego identity. It can only come from the surrender of ego identity. In the same way that in the final phase of Buddhism, in Japan, both Zen sects became pretty much dead in the water because there were no longer any Zen masters who either could reach silence or create an authentic koan or mando or dharma combat. And the new forms of Buddhism that were arising that were no longer the same sort of Buddhism, which was based on discovering who you are beyond the ego, but instead were a recognition that I can't get out of my delusion and all I can do is pray to Amida Buddha, the Buddha of infinite light, through repeating some mantra. And somehow, because I can't even have faith in Amida, but I'll pretend to have faith in Amida and say the mantra once in a while, and even that will be enough to get me into Sukhavati one day, which is the name of the Western paradise where, those faithful Buddhists will go. So you don't need faith, you don't need even surrender, because you can't. And you don't have the ability to have faith in yourself or in anything. But what you can do is to recognize the truth of your condition and realize that the one who is recognizing it is no longer under the jurisdiction of that belief system and of the rules that delusion creates in the form of limitation of your capacity for conscious expansion. So the bottom line, I would say, between that occurred between this shift from what they call self-power to other power. In other words, I can't do it. God save me, or maybe you'll save me if I repeat this mantra, if I remember to do it. But the realization that the one that you think you are is helpless, in a flux that it cannot control, it cannot understand where it's heading, it cannot cope with, it cannot manage, and that it's too fragile to be able to survive very long before breakdown. If one can recognize that state, that the ego has in fact entered, in which it is filled with negative projections and opinions about itself and complete despair and dismay about any hope for the world, that itself is a delusional belief system. And be able to step just one centimeter outside of that limited sphere of belief that you take for granted about yourself, then there is the infinite potentiality for a rebirth as a completely unknowable kind of being who has capacities that you cannot in advance either invoke or suppose or insist upon, but that through your openness to discovery, you will be able to be saturated by. Because the power that created all of this, whether it's a delusion or a reality, that power has also created you, and cannot be anything but you in the form of a representation of itself in holographic form. And therefore, the entirety of the intelligence of the universe from beginning to end is contained within your consciousness at this moment. And the accessing of it is simply based on the requirement of being willing to go out of your mind. But to go out of your mind not in a paranoid way, but in a metanoid way. So they say you're either metanoid, paranoid, or just annoyed. But what you want to be is not any of those, but in that state that is completely inconceivable, because that is the truth of what we are. And I hope that that inconceivability will bring you the same bliss that it has brought to all the sages, including Buddha and Christ and all of those great beings who have been forgotten in the depths of time, but whose intelligence remains part of the noetic field that is supporting our own attainment of the Buddhahood, that is already our inheritance and our nature, that is now again the emergent property that must now become our reality, because that is the design of the system of the universe in which we find ourselves, and that we find within ourselves, and that is the self.